Hello, I am Paul Papaioanu, and I'm going to talk to you today about how we can use game theory to make better decisions. Let me tell you first a little bit about myself. I am the founder and managing director of Dragonfly. We are a strategy consulting firm that specializes in using decision analysis and particularly game theory, as well as other innovative approaches. And I have an academic background initially where I got a PhD from UCLA, and then I was a professor at the University of California, San Diego, and at Harvard University. I then left academia to start a consulting career. And shortly after I started, I joined SDG, Strategic Decisions Group, which, as many of you know, is the firm that kind of put decision analysis on the map in the business world. And then I started my own firm, SGG, which I ran for more than 10 years before I joined Shell as an internal consultant, where I was basically pushing decision analysis and decision quality efforts, as well as doing game theory. I've been a fellow in the Society of Decision Professionals since 2011, shortly after my book, Game Theory for Business, came out. I've done consulting for companies in various industries. Most of my work has been in oil and gas, doing a lot of work for Chevron and Shell in particular, but also other companies. I've done work as well in pharmaceuticals and high tech, manufacturing, renewables, and alternative energy, as well as in consumer products. So I have a fairly broad and diverse background in applying game theory and decision analysis. And what I want to talk to you today is about the game theory side of what I do. And we'll talk about three things. First, what game theory is and why it's important to use it. How game theory can be a practical tool, how game theory has helped companies that I've worked mitigate risks and capture significant value. So those are the three issues I want to talk about today. So let's get to it. What is game theory and why do I need it? Well, game theory is poorly named. It's not really a theory, and it's not really about games with winners and losers necessarily. Game theory is a tool that enables us to analyze interactive situations, and it enables us to address a key question: should we compete or cooperate, and how should we do so? And that's really due to John Nash, who was the subject of the Oscar-winning movie A Beautiful Mind. And what John Nash did was he saw that game theory at that time was only a zero-sum, took only a zero-sum approach. Someone wins and someone loses, or there's a tie. He thought that was very limiting, and that game theory should be more general, because there were many situations where companies, for example, cooperate with one another and form strategic alliances. So he created an equilibrium concept that allowed us to look at win-win, lose-lose, and win-lose situations. So it became a much more, it became a tool with much broader applicability thanks to John Nash. Game theory also provides us with a nice logic and a clear structure for thinking through interactive situations. In other words, it helps us see what the chessboard looks like and how moves in the chessboard could unfold. It also helps us predict and prescribe optimal strategic behavior for the key players. Now, in economics, game theory has gotten a lot of notoriety. There have been 5 Nobel Prizes since 1994, when John Nash won the Nobel Prize, that have gone to game theorists. And one of the famous game theorists who won the Nobel Prize was Thomas Schelling. And when the Nobel Committee gave him the award, They noted that game theory has become a universally accepted tool in language. That I found was very true in academia, where I, started my professional career. But that was not so true in the business world, where it is very underused, in my opinion. So let's talk about why it should be used more and how we can use it more. So think about this simple example. Here we have a decision tree, which probably most of you are familiar with. And these are used, of course, in decision analysis quite often. And in this decision tree, a player has a decision to make about whether to enter a market or not. Now, the incumbent then has to choose whether to cut or hold prices, but you'll notice that there is a chance event node, a circle there, and there's some probability about whether the incumbent will cut or hold prices. In the top part, if the entrant does not enter, the incumbent would hold prices 100%, we believe. And that seems non-controversial, right? Because why would the incumbent cut prices when there's no competition? However, what would the incumbent do if he saw entry by the other player? Well, here you assign some probability, and in this case we've just assigned a 50-50 probability, a coin flip, to whether they would cut or hold prices. And the entrant looks at this and says, okay, well, if the incumbent cuts prices, I lose 30. If the incumbent holds prices, I make 20. And since it's a 50-50 probability, I would, on an expected value basis, I would lose money. So I would choose to not enter in this case. Now, what if we do this with game theory? So here we show a game tree in which we model other players' choices as decisions, and we model their payoffs. So those are the two key things that are different here. You'll notice there's a green node, and it's a funny shaped node, I understand. It's called a logic node. And then there's a red logic node for the incumbent. We no longer have the uncertainty node there. And you'll see on the right are the incumbent's payoffs for different outcomes. So if we look at the top two branches, we see that the incumbent should hold prices because 60 is better than 30. So that confirms the intuition that we had in the prior decision tree. Now, what about on the bottom? Would the incumbent cut or hold prices? Well, here we see that the incumbent would get 40 from holding prices and 20 from cutting prices. So the incumbent should hold their prices. Now, what does that mean for the entrant? Well, the entrant should enter, because if the entrant enters and the incumbent holds prices, the entrant will get 20, and that certainly is better than 0. So we have a totally different prescription here for the entrant. The prescription before was not to enter the market. Now we say that the entrant should enter the market. So the prescription is different. You also notice we have probability 1 that the incumbent would hold prices no matter what. So we're no longer guessing about what the right probability is. We're looking at what's in it for the incumbent to understand which way they should move. And in this case, we find that the incumbent would hold their prices. You'll notice too, there's sort of a chess logic here, right? The entrant is looking ahead and saying, what would be the incumbent's best move given my move? And making a decision to enter the market because the incumbent's best move is to hold prices rather than cut prices. So not only does the game tree give us a different prescription, it's a different logic, and it's a much more intuitive and reasonable logic. Think about it this way. If you were playing a game of chess, you would not ask yourself, what probability would my opponent move his rook or his knight? No, you're going to think through, what's my best move given what my opponent would do in response. And you're trying to think that through 2 or 3 moves into the future. That is a much more sensible way of trying to think through strategic interactions such as we have here. So the game theory approach, a game tree, will give us a much more intuitive and better logic upon which to base our decisions. Now, in the business world, as I said, game theory can help us with the question of should we compete or cooperate, and how should we do so. And the way I think about it is there's a 3C space where game theory applies. The top 2, collaboration and coordination, are forms of cooperation. With collaboration, there's an incentive for 2 or more parties to cooperate, but there's also an incentive to deviate and cheat. And that's the reason we have contracts in the business world, because we want to make sure that the parties come through on their side of the bargain. Coordination issues don't necessarily need some formal institutionalization, because there's a win-win that's possible. It's just there's a difference over the potential win-win. Now, that's the reason we would go into any sort of negotiation, is when we see that there's a potential for a win-win. Now, you may ask yourself, well, but we typically sign some sort of contract after we negotiate. True. And that's because you can sign the contract. You would go into the negotiation because you see the win-win, but once the agreement is signed, there are things that have to be done by each of the parties in order for everything to work out. So there are elements of collaboration in most sorts of negotiations as well. And then we get to competitive issues. Some of these are not terribly interesting. 2 companies may be just competing as hard as they can on price and quality, and not that interesting. In other cases, we have situations in which one or both parties need to establish credibility and show resolve. For example, labor management negotiations are often characterized by chicken-like situations in which labor and management are trying to figure out who will blink first, who will swerve first. And at the same time, they're trying to negotiate because there's a win-win potential for both labor and management, and they will have to sign some sort of an agreement institutionalizing or formalizing their agreement. So what that example shows is that most problems in the business world don't fit neatly into one of these 3 corners of the triangle. Instead, there are elements of each of these 3 in most interesting business problems in the real world. Now, in terms of more specifically business strategy questions, we typically talk about build, buy, ally decisions. These are not only central questions in business strategy, they're ones where game theory should be employed in most cases. So build decisions involve investments. Well, there are lots of uncertainties involving investments, but some of them in many cases are whether making some sort of an investment will give us a competitive advantage, or might it risk overcapacity in the market, or would others be deterred from market entry if we do this investment? These sorts of questions could be very important beyond sort of the traditional investment risks and uncertainties, and game theory can help us think those through. Buy decisions, should we acquire somebody? What competitive advantage would we create? How does the game change once we make an acquisition? And what terms should we negotiate so that we don't leave value on the table? And alliance decisions are also very important. Should we partner with someone, or is it better to go it alone? What's a win-win deal? And how do we make sure that we don't suffer from partner drag and that this will be something where we could be aligned with our partner going forward? These are all considerations that one needs to think about in these central questions in business strategy, and game theory can have a lot to say about those. So if game theory is so important, the next question is, how can it be a practical tool? I've had many people say to me, oh, well, I took a game theory class and I learned some interesting things and it seems kind of cute, but I don't really understand how it can be practical. So let's talk about how it can be practical. About 20 years ago, I developed this strategic gaming approach, and it was focused on 5 questions. Who are the players? What choices do they have? What sequence might they make those choices, or might they move simultaneously? What are the key uncertainties? And these could be things like chance events. Is there oil in the ground? Will my drug pass through phase 2 and phase 3 trials? And then finally, what are the payoffs to each of the players in the game from different possible outcomes? And we do this, we think about these 5 questions in our approach, and we start by framing up the problem, and doing that requires that we think through the first 4 questions. And the fourth as well as, and then the 5th question comes into the strategy evaluation, where we usually build some sort of an economic model to come up with the payoffs for each of the players. And then we need to do the execution planning. So here, strategic gaming is a little bit different than a lot of strategy approaches, which are at the 35,000 foot level. With strategic gaming, we are then trying to also do not just 35,000 foot strategy, but we're trying to talk through tactics and implementation. How do we implement our strategy in the most effective way? And so that can be very important, and it gets us to a tactical level as well as the strategic. So let's talk about what we do in framing, evaluation, and execution planning. The framing usually involves building a game tree of some sort. On the left, you see a standard game tree in which a green player and a red player have some moves. There's an uncertainty in there as well. And we've sort of fleshed out every branch of the tree. That may work for quite a number of issues, but in many cases, we have a lot more complexity than something like that. And when we do, we typically use a schematic game tree, such as is shown on the right. In the schematic game tree, we can lay out a lot more choices and uncertainties by the players, and sort of really think through like what the game looks like going forward. We often simplify it after that, but this gives us a way of really laying things out in a practical way for everybody. When we move to evaluation, we're using 2 principles. The first is to look forward and reason back, much like you would in a game of chess. So in the example between the entrant and incumbent, we talked about how the entrant had to look forward and think through, well, what would the incumbent do in response, and therefore what should I do? The second evaluation principle is that we have to assume rationality, and I mean economic rationality, not psychological. Each of the players has to try to maximize their own payoffs in the game. That may sound like a strong assumption, but in many cases, we've had clients who said that a certain player was not acting rationally and was doing sort of irrational things. And more often than not, in fact, almost 100% of the time, when we thought through the game very carefully, we realized that the other player was acting quite rationally. Companies don't try to do silly things in most cases. They try to make rational decisions, and for the most part, what we found is that companies were doing what you would expect them to do from an economically rational point of view. And it probably didn't appear that way because we hadn't put ourselves into the shoes and minds of the other player well enough. Now, having said that, the rationality assumption is a strong assumption, and it is one that we often relax when we get to execution planning. We will often think about psychological factors or cultural factors and such when we put together our tactics. So there is an ability to relax the assumption when you get to thinking through the tactical side of things. But when we do evaluation, we do have to assume the rationality assumption, and it's typically a pretty good one. Now, where do the numbers come from that we're going to use for the evaluation? We usually are building a spreadsheet model of some sort. It may have various decisions in it. It might, by each of the players, it might have deal terms such as are shown in the example here. And out of those, we then use those to help determine what the cash flows are for each of the players. So effectively, we're building a model not just from our own perspective, but from the other player's perspective as well. In these models, you can build in the uncertainties like you would in any other model. And then the model will generate the payoffs for ourselves and counterparties or other players. We can look at different metrics like you would typically do in any project. You know, most projects are not going to look just at NPV. They're going to look at how much CapEx is involved or what the efficiency is of using that CapEx. We also can use our model to then do analysis of the key uncertainties and risks with a tornado for each of the players, not just ourselves. We can also look at the range of value based on various risks and uncertainties for each of the players. And this range of value I've seen can be very important when we're thinking about various deals, for example. And so in this case, we're looking at 3 different deals, and we find that the deal on the left is not as good for the red player as it is for the blue player. There's kind of a large gap. The middle one is much worse for the blue player than the red player, so that's probably not a realistic deal. And the one on the right has a similar expected value for each of the players. The red player has a higher upside but more risk than the blue player has. This is the potential for a deal. This is something that's closer to a deal, and maybe you can use that as a starting point for thinking through what could be a win-win deal, and then adjust your terms to get something that might be even better. So you don't have to just use the game trees and look at the numbers in the trees. You can use S-curves as well. And then there is execution planning, where we're trying to get alignment around not only the 35,000-foot strategy, but also tactics. Typically, we are building a dynamic roadmap, which is basically a contingency plan that tells the company, well, what should they do under different circumstances and based on how the game unfolds, given the moves of other players or given the revelation of different uncertainties. And so this flow chart that's shown on the left is an example of one such contingency plan. And typically we supplement something like this with more details on tactics. So it's not just this, but it also has some significant tactical details that we develop with the client. Another thing we might do in some cases, in negotiation cases in particular, is something we call negotiation ready. We take the outputs from our strategic gaming analysis, what the win-win space is, and you know what sort of things might be useful to do, And then we have to put it into something of a checklist where we say, what sort of things do we need to do to make sure that we're really fully prepared and we've thought through everything. And you can download a short presentation on Negotiation Ready from my website. I know this is hard to read and we're kind of going through this quickly, but you'll be able to go and download this information later on. So that's the basic. Those are the basics of the strategic gaming approach that makes game theory a much more practical tool than you might otherwise think. So then the question is, does it really help? How has it helped companies mitigate risks and capture value? So I have a couple of specific examples here, and I'll talk about some others as well. First of these involves an oil and gas company we'll call Nash, and a rig supplier who's supplying Nash. And this rig supplier has demanded a 15% increase in price from Nash. Nash could accept that and bear those additional costs, or it could reject. If it rejects and the supplier backs down, well, then you're back to the current rates. The supplier could also walk away, meaning they take all of their 70 rigs that they're supplying to Nash and walk away, which would be enormously dangerous for Nash. They could also back down, but move some rigs to other producers. So then the question was, well, how many could they actually move to other producers? These rigs did not work on all sorts of fields. They had a very particular application. And what we realized is that of the 70 that this supplier was supplying to Nash, they could only move somewhere between 10 and 30 of those rigs in all likelihood. So that told us that Nash might have some leverage here because the supplier couldn't just walk away entirely, or they would probably be shooting themselves in the foot. On the other hand, if the supplier moved any rigs, Nash would have to shut in some fields, and then over time could bring in other alternative suppliers to help servicing those fields. But that would take time, and it would mean shutting in some wells. So we had to look at the numbers here, and it was a very simple model, but basically what we found is that Nash had a lot of leverage. In the graph on the left, you see that if the rigs pulled by the supplier range between 10 and 30, our expectation for what the supplier could place with others, Nash actually does a little bit better. Why is that? Well, Nash would shut in some low producing wells, but over time, it would also bring in other suppliers at the current rates. So this actually would save Nash some money versus, accepting the higher rates. And it wasn't until you get to more than 40 rigs being pulled by the supplier that Nash would start to get hurt. So this told us that Nash had quite a substantial amount of leverage, because if the supplier said they were going to pull some rigs, Nash could say, fine, go ahead, make my day. We'll do better. Now, what if the supplier tried to pull all rigs? Well, if they could only place between 10 and 30 with others, then they would definitely, as we would expect, be shooting themselves in the foot. Now, if they could actually place more than 40 with other producers, then they could make more money. But we didn't think that was very likely at all. So the chances are Nash could call the supplier's bluff and say, we're not going to accept this price increase we're going to stand firm because you don't really have a better alternative and you can't really hurt us. Another example is in licensing and co-marketing negotiations in the biopharma world. This is a case, and these are very common, where a biotech wants to out-license to a big pharma company that can promote its drug more strongly than the biotech can. And what we found is that in this case, the biotech could offer two basic types of deals. One is a tiered deal where there's sort of an incentive structure, or they could just offer a flat deal of a certain percentage. And the flat deal we found was not very, was not going to produce the appropriate incentives for the big pharma company to promote the drugs strongly. So value would have to be given up, and that wouldn't be as appealing as doing the tiered deal. So let's move to the top part of the tree where a tiered deal is offered. The big pharma will accept it, and they would promote strongly. But there's some room to negotiate here because you know, there's the big pharma company could say, I want $475 million of additional value from the tiered deal, because the biotech company would get 725 versus 250. So they could actually try to push up against anywhere closer to that 250 million. If you're looking at it from the biotech's perspective, the biotech could demand up to $450 million more in value, because the big pharma company wants to do better than 1,300, and as long as they do better than 1,300, they don't need the 1,750. They just need something better than 1,300 to promote the drug strongly. So the win-win space here is quite large, and depending on which of these two plays the game smarter and has thought through this analysis from each of the players' perspectives more, that player will probably come out doing much better, all else equal. Now, many projects that I've worked on with billions of dollars in value capture, I've worked on probably more than 10 asset swap and unitization deals in the upstream oil and gas business, each of them worth $200 million to $2 billion. And typically, the value capture has been around 10% of that number. In pipeline strategy and tariff deals, I've done also a lot of work. One of these projects led to $1 billion in value. We basically looked at the alternatives that the client had, and we found that for a $250 million investment that gave them some option value for getting some third-party tariff revenue, they could actually realize a great deal more value. And in fact, a couple of years later, they secured a deal that added $1 billion of value. I've done some work on LNG where you have to look at the full value chain, and so you have lots of different players involved. And in one case, in looking at win-wins throughout the value chain for each of the players, I found that my client was in a very strong position and can negotiate terms that actually added $1 billion of value over what they thought they would see in NPV terms. I've also worked with an alternative energy company on strategic alliances that enabled them to create a leading position for themselves and grow their revenues 20 times over the next 2 years. So that was very successful for what was at the time a very small company, and it's now grown to be a clear leader in their industry. We've also worked on supplier negotiations for major equipment in the oil and gas industry that have captured more than $1 billion in 9 or 10 projects. And you can see from the quotes that are here that our clients were quite happy with how we helped them negotiate with key suppliers. In biopharma, I've worked on multiple licensing and co-marketing agreements worth over $1.5 billion. One of those I showed you an example of. And in these, we were generally trying to ensure win-wins with appropriate promotion incentives for the players. And that led to a lot of additional value. And in fact, if you don't get the appropriate promotion incentives, that can cost a lot of money down the road. We've also done work in pharma launch and pricing strategies, which has helped to focus efforts of teams on what they should do in terms of launch, and also how they price to gain market share and maximize value. And in one such case, that led to more than $1 billion in value. We've also helped negotiate win-win deals with partners on new technologies. In one case, this was worth $50 to $100 million to each party. And for a major tech company that was launching a new technology, we showed them that if they took a different strategy toward key competitors and partners, that was going to lead to a value swing of $1 billion. So there's a lot of ways that value can be added by applying a game theoretic approach. It is also, I took one of my roles at Shell when I was there was to really push decision quality and improving decision quality there. And to be honest, if you don't use game theory for many of these sorts of problems, you're not going to be able to ensure decision quality. Your frame is not going to be right. You're not going to be looking at the alternatives with enough creativity. You're not going to be looking at the alternatives that the other players have, which can be very important. You're not going to be thinking about the right information or the right values and trade-offs. The logic, the sound reasoning will not be there because you're not thinking through the chess game, as it were. And then, because game theory can help you, tell a better story, a more sensible, logical, intuitive story about what decisions should be made, that also helps get a commitment to action in the end. So game theory can really be essential to ensuring decision quality. I'm now at about my time limit here, so I'll finish here by saying, I would love to hear from you. My contact information is here. You can check out my website where there are videos, presentations, articles, and tools in the information and tools page. My book is available on Amazon or directly from the publisher. And you can ask them for a discount by going through them. So that should be a little less expensive than Amazon, at least if you're in the United States. It is also a book that's available on the Kindle and in the iTunes store, so you can get it electronically. Thank you for listening. I hope you found this interesting and informative. And again, if you want to ask me any questions, or discuss any potential project work where me and my firm may be able to help you, I will be happy to talk to you. Thank you and have a good day. Bye-bye.